Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Vlog and Podcast. So we like to do this vlog and podcast every week at approximately 8 a.m. London time, but it's really just a kind of wrap up from the news from the week. So at the moment, I think the two main themes for this week actually will be food sense and CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. It's These two things sound so sort of diametrically opposite. One of them's for measuring the capsaicin in chilies, and the other one's for measuring the glucose, for example, in diabetics. And they seem so separate and different, but in fact, in the end, this is the power of electrochemical analysis that, in fact, it can cover both these things. So we did do a webinar during the week. I think we do say it quite a lot that our commitment to the Food Sense product is, we do weekly webinars. Everyone who's a customer gets personalized training or personal training, and we also do monthly webinars so that we can kind of keep on how do I say this, keep on updating and making sure that people are well trained. Anyway, all that said, let me dive forward a little bit more. So we did do our weekly webinar, and it was useful because we had somebody who was testing in Korea at the time, South Korea obviously, and they were basically under diluting. So I was able to kind of address their problems, show them that they were getting a signal because it was basically saturated with capsaicin. Capsaicin is not terribly soluble, so we were able to address that. Another question I was able to address was also Carolina Reapers. They have a reputation for being 2.2 million, and I suspect that they are. But you can't guarantee that just because you have a Carolina Reaper powder that it is 2.2 million Scoville heat units. Especially if you don't have any kind of certificate of analysis on it and you're just using kind of, belief, let's say. So you can get these things tested by HPLC. You've got to be a little bit careful because there's two methods of HPLC testing, or two methodologies. ASTA 21.3 and AOAC 99.5.03. They're two different methods, and I'm still looking into this, but I got a suspicion that the AOAC method actually might be more more accurate. But of course, at ZP we're completely biased because actually we think the best method is actually Food Sense, which is not an HPLC method. It's a quick, easy to do system. But anyway, I looked at the Carolina Reaper and I kind of said, look, you can't just assume that it's all 22 million Scoville heat units. You've actually got to think about your own history with this chili powder. How long have you had it stored? What conditions have you had it stored under? Was it exposed to light? Was it exposed to temperature? Is it exposed to humidity? Capsaicin is an organic molecule. It doesn't just hang around in this infinitely stable state. It actually degrades quite a bit. So I suppose all that said, that at ZP we're quite passionate about the products, including the Food Sense, and actually we'll really dig into the science behind, not just behind the product bit, but behind the samples that we're even testing. So, and I think an extension on that was, we did actually look at the Carolina Reaper. I think we're the only people who have actually done a meta-analysis and looked at all the different scientific papers out there on Carolina Reapers and shown that actually there's quite a variability between 3 million Scoville heat units for Carolina Reaper to 500,000 Scoville heat units, which is basically 6x. So you got to be a little bit careful when you just assume something about a particular product, especially when you don't really have any HPLC data or any other data to back it up, let's say. Something else, of course, is that we do our weekly webinar. So we are doing a weekly webinar on Thursday, the 8th of February, and any questions that have kind of come in during the week, we will answer those during our webinar. I've actually just done a webinar this morning because there's so many questions coming in these days, technical questions. So this morning, today is Sunday, the 4th of February, but we answered questions about the integration between lateral flow and electrochemistry. We did questions about CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. We also did questions about lactate and I want to say potassium as well, but I missed potassium off the list. But we did do a webinar this morning, and there is another webinar then coming on the Thursday, the 8th of February. So these are coming bi-weekly. I don't want to kind of say that they'll always be bi-weekly because it really depends on the on the number of questions that have come in during the week. But I've already got some questions loaded up for Thursday. So if you're just interested in dropping in, that'll probably go live about 8 a.m. London time. We like to do them live because I think it just gives it, sometimes when things are too scripted, things that would otherwise have just occurred to you, you don't say it, but, we like to sort of have that kind of live, I don't know if to call it a broadcast, that's a bit too, but we do like to have these kind of live events, let's say. Something that has also come up, as you can see, we are quite committed to food sense. This is just a little bit of history, but there was a guy in about 1912 in the US. He was a pharmacist called Wilbur Scoville. So when you think about chilies, they often use this unit, the Scoville Heat Unit, SHUs. Now these days there are objective ways of measuring SHUs. There's HPLC, super expensive, actually not quite as accurate as people really believe. And then there's Food Sense, which is much lower cost, and I think is actually pretty accurate, and is transparency. Now I use the word transparency very carefully. Transparency means you can see the raw signal. So I can, because it's a very cloud-enabled system, if I want to troubleshoot or back up, what the machine is saying, I can actually look at the raw signals. This is probably the only analytical system in the world so cloud-enabled that actually, the manufacturer can be invited by you to look at the data. We can go in there, check the data, make sure everything's working okay. Anyway, backing up a little bit, Wilbur Scoville, 1912, came up with this organoleptic method for testing the hotness of chilies. And basically what he did is he would take a panel of people and he would progressively dilute samples until about 60% of the panel reported that they could no longer taste the chilies. But that means that one person might have stopped at dilution 1, another person might have stopped at dilution 3, another person might have stopped at dilution 5. So there's quite a error or in that result. It's only when the third person has agreed, or not the third, if there was a panel of 5 and the third person suddenly agreed that they can't taste it, then you call it at that point. So it's not particularly accurate, and it has been replaced by HPLC. And actually now by the Food Sense as well. But I did want to describe this Scoville Heat Unit, because I think people use this term, Scoville Heat Unit, and they talk about Wilbur Scoville 1912. You'll find plenty of papers or even videos about that, but you find very few people that actually even describe what it is to run these Scoville organoleptic tests. But we did do a video about that this week as well. Something that ZP does a lot of, and I realized that ZP has been working on what we call digital twins for years. It just wasn't called digital twins once upon a time, but a digital twin is a kind of representation of a physical, it could be a physical object, it could be a field, it could be a bioprocessing, it could be a bioreactor, it could be a human being. But a sort of digital twin is sort of saying that I've built a model of this system, and I'm able to make predictions about this system. And also, I'm able to, what we like to do at ZP is actually enhance that model by having real-time data that's feeding into the model. So you can essentially sort of, if it was for example, if it was a river, you could have sensors in the river measuring nitrate, phosphate, potassium. But then you could also make predictions of what that's going to do based on weather forecast. That would be kind of like what a digital twin would do. It would bring in several data sources, maybe current and maybe predictive, and maybe over past data as well. So you're looking at now, the future, and the past, and you're combining it to kind of be able to give you useful information now about the system. And it's not restricted, as I say, it can be used in health, environmental, precision agriculture, biological systems. I think the concept of digital twin works best in actually complex systems. If it's a simple system would be like a sort of a pulley system. I pull here and something lifts there. Well, you don't super need a digital twin for that. Input equals output. But when output can actually be quite sensitive to inputs, then maybe a digital twin actually plays in, is quite a nice concept. I think they've been around for a lot longer than people have been calling them digital twins, but digital twin sort of, it suggests, that you have a complex system and you've made a twin of it, but that twin happens to be mostly code. And really related to that really then is probably CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, that in CGM, actually they do use this slight concept of digital twin because they are trying all the time, trying to manage somebody's glucose levels or their diabetes. And so CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, is really part of that. But then people are trying to use and the concept of artificial pancreas, where you're actually able to maybe add in insulin to somebody. And sort of you need that digital twin concept to kind of understand the link between input and output there, between what I measure in somebody's glucose and how much insulin I would otherwise need to give them. So digital twin, different thing, but actually CGM is an example I would suggest of a digital twin, or at least it's CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, and the management of diabetes actually would be a good application of digital twin, and I think it's already done. They just don't necessarily call it digital twin quite so much. Something else that we did cover this week as well in our the webinar we did this morning is actually lateral flow. Lateral flow is a really good technology. COVID-19, most people are going around doing home testing. You also do lateral flow strips for testing things like pregnancy as well. So it does work well. Problem with it, it's not necessarily digital. People try to use cameras and stuff, but it doesn't. Digital just means you take an image. Sorry, cameras. You take an image, you convert the image, and I would say that there is a way, that is a form of digitalization. I think possibly a better way of doing it is actually to integrate lateral flows with electrochemical sensors. And I think you can get much more quantification if you do that as well. So we have been playing with the concept of integration between electrochemistry and lateral flow strips. And so we did include that in a webinar today. So if I was just to do a summary of the week, at a global level, we've this week talked about FoodSense, a handheld device for measuring capsaicin and food ingredients and things like capsaicin in chilies. But we've also, expanded it, which is our way of, talking about actually, the things that we're testing, the Carolina Reaper, also talking about the history of hotness testing, the Wilbur-Scoville organoleptic testing, talking about digital twins, and then drawing that parallel between digital twins and actually managing type 1 diabetics. And then also then talking about IVD, in vitro diagnostics, lateral flow strips. And in our webinars, we did talk about actually how to, if you did do an integration between a lateral flow strip and a screen-printed electrode, how to integrate those two things and make a product from it. Now, as normal, this is just a wrap-up from the things that we talked about this week. If you've got any questions for ZP, if you watch any of our webinars, you see that we actually answer them in quite a lot of detail. So I hope that is... If you've got any questions, send them in to us, and we'll be sure to cover them at some point. Otherwise, have a good week, and hopefully speak to some of you next week. Okay, thanks so much.